Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters for Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm Carl, and I'm your host this week. This week's guest is Greg Lutze. Greg is the co-founder of VSCO. VSCO is probably a household name to many of our listeners. It's a very popular photo filtering technology that was founded in 2011, sort of at the dawn of what you might call the Instagram era. And at the time, it was a pretty revolutionary product because digital mobile photo editing was kind of rudimentary, and some of the filters that were available on the platforms at the time were a bit, by today's standards, a bit rough. And VSCO was really established with the photographer or the purist in mind. The goal was to allow people to create beautiful work and use really high-end filters on their photography. But what's interesting about Greg's story, the idea behind VSCO was not just to release a tool, but to create a community of like-minded people who cared about photography, who maybe were into vintage film photography and wanted to capture some of that spirit and some of that authenticity and even some of that humanity, and sort of celebrating the art and the craft and the form. This week's host is Bill Connolly, and our regular listeners will note that Bill usually does these intros with me. He is not here this week. He's down in Miami working on a top secret project, leaving me here to ramble to myself. So I will put an end to that, turn it over to Bill and Greg for a really interesting conversation that I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Creative Characters. I'm your host for today, Bill Connolly, and I am really excited to be joined by my guest today, Greg Lutze. Greg is a founder, advisor, and artist based out of California. We came to know his work through a variety of different projects that he's working on that I'm excited to talk to him about today. But he also just has a really wonderful perspective on the evolution of the art community and the role of the artist. And so I'm really excited to speak with him today. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Bill. I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited because I think this could go in a ton of different directions. But I always like to start by just level setting and learning a little bit more about you and how you kind of, got into art, got into, the design sort of photography space, and just to hear what brought you to this point today.
Well, for as long as I can remember, I always have liked to make things, and I've always liked hanging out with artists and creative people. I just feel at home there. But I do think probably if I had to choose one event early on that was like, oh yeah, that was pretty pivotal in my life, it was actually in kindergarten. And my teacher had taught me how to color within the lines of a picture, where you kind of outline and then you color in. And I came home and my mom said, oh, this is really good. I felt really proud of it. She's like, this is really good, but I just wanted to let you know, if you want to, it's totally okay to color outside of the lines. And it blew my mind as a 5-year-old at that point, because I was like, oh no, you're supposed to stay in the lines, and that is what success is. And just her saying that has always stuck with me, that it's okay to just try things and play around and do what you want artistically. And so that's always set the ground for me. And then growing up, I was always into music. I would do these like punk rock zines. I would draw logos of sports teams. I didn't even realize at that point that was like, you could have a career around that. And then when I graduated high school, I was like, not sure what to do. And my dad was like, well, you got to figure out something to do, because we can't pay for more than 4 years. So you need to be focused. He's like, why don't you just do like business? Because business is, covers so many different things. And so I did business marketing because it had the least amount of math classes. And by starting to do business marketing, I just started learning more about like, oh, there's like design and like campaigns, and all of my love for the photocopy, punk rock zine stuff. I was like, oh no, that's design, and music and creativity, all that started to come in together. And so I was doing a marketing degree. And then at the same time, this was like late 90s, early 2000s, just taking whatever classes I could to learn around like digital, all like, Dreamweaver and Director and Flash and all that. And so I just loved that era. It all kind of came at one time together.
You touch on a couple of things there that I think are just really incredible, and not the case for every kid. But when your mother told you it's okay to color outside the lines, there's a researcher who in the 1960s who studied children by applying this NASA creativity test, right? And determined that 97% of children thought at the level of creative genius. And then that number dropped.
What?
Yeah, that number dropped precipitously as you got older, to the point where adults, call it people over the age of 28, 30, I don't know exactly, that number dropped all the way to 2%, right? And so
wow.
I think the prevailing finding there was that we are inherently creative beings, and we are then kind of learned, or taught not to be creative through those systems that exist.
I wonder why that is. Part of me thinks maybe it's because, as a kid, you're like super curious about things and everything is new and exciting. But as we grow old, we get all these like cynical ideas or really strong perspectives and we're not curious anymore. But like when you're young and you're curious and like, I don't know, you can just make stuff and you're not worried about what other people think. That's interesting. I haven't heard that stat before, but that's curious.
I think that's it, actually. I think the last piece is my theory on it. It's because, two things. One, you become more practical, I suppose, right? So it's like taking the risk of being a creative. It's like at some point you have bills to pay, you have dependents who need you and need an income and that sort of stuff. And so it's just harder to make those decisions. But I think the other piece is really that when you're young, you don't identify an act of creative expression as part of your identity in the same way, where that vulnerability isn't as discerning. And what I mean by that is when you're a kid, you just create something. You don't care if people are like, hey, the sky is not purple, it's blue. You're just like, well, I want it to be purple. But especially as a creative, and we have talked about this before on the show, an act of creative expression is an act of vulnerability, because if the audience doesn't like it, they don't like you. They don't like some element of who you are, right?
Totally.
And so that becomes a lot harder, I think, for people to overcome that sort of, especially if they've then gone down a path where they haven't pursued a creative endeavor as a career. It's harder for them to reignite that, but not impossible. Certainly it's possible to get that back. So anyway, kudos to your mom for thinking to give you the permission to continue being creative, because oftentimes I think that's all it really needs, to grow in someone like yourself.
I'm forever thankful of that. And to your point there, it's interesting, like thinking back then, I was probably seeking my mom's approval and did I like it? Whereas in this day and age, whether you're doing design or a campaign or you're just posting to social media, you are like worried so much about what other people think that it loses some of its, just the act of creating loses some of its joy, because the audience is so big and it's impossible to please everybody. I don't know. I
would even take it a step. This could be just me, but like I also think the creative world is has so much more cynicism in it than a lot of other disciplines too. It's like if you're, and I mean, we see this in the typography world, but like, anytime there's a new design, a new rebrand, people are very quick to have opinions about it. Anytime there's a new song as a musical artist, people are very polar opinions on it. They love or hate it. There's no sort of middle ground. And that, I don't think that happens so much in other areas of business. I mean, I could be way off, but I just think that there tends to be such an opinionated audience in the creative world that, it can be kind of scary to put something out there.
Well, I guess that makes sense. I mean, because in some ways, if let's say you're a designer, you are paid to have a perspective on things, right? Like your design has a perspective and a way to communicate. But so, I mean, like I have an opinion on everything and it almost comes instantly. But something that I've tried to stop is being like, whether it's like new technology or some art comes out and like, I'm like, no, okay, let's step back and like, can I be open to this? And I do think that maybe not just for creativity, but just for remaining a youthful perspective, like you have to be open to new things. You have to be open to different perspectives that are completely different than what yours would be, or even different technologies. I'm 43 now, but I just realize as I observe other creators that have, had longer careers, I think the ones that are doing things that are interesting are the ones that are open and curious, and they have that judgment and they have that perspective, but they kind of, instead of just like reacting right away and being like, oh, it's crap, I'm moving on, like being like, okay, let's look at that and let's give it some thought.
So you study business in college. You then take a bunch of classes and in the creative world in photography or flash and development, that sort of stuff. And you're trying to figure out, how do I make this into a career, right? So what happens then? What happens next?
Yeah. So, man, I don't know if you call it like blessed or like whatever. I fell in with an amazing team called Asterisk Studio. They're now called Invisible Creature, but at the time this was Don and Ryan Clark and Dimitri Argis. And we did design for the music industry, which is literally the coolest thing that you could do. And this is early 2000s. And so, I mean, I was doing Flash websites and t-shirts and CDs and photography for bands, from everything from super little indie bands to, I mean, this is like early to mid 2000s. There's a lot of the gangster rap. So we were doing stuff for like G Unit. And then there was a lot of the rap metal. So we were doing stuff for like POD and Limp Bizkit and Papa Roach, which, like it was just a fun time just to make stuff. And so for me, I was super fortunate that almost immediately my passion for music and photography and design and art all came together at one point. And in a way that, like, I didn't realize at the time how incredible that actually was, but I'm super grateful for the time that I was there. So that was really my first part of my career, was just all music industry stuff.
I think I've had a lot of overlap in the music world. Fonts and type play a big role in that space too, from album art to merchandise. As music has moved into digital spaces, I think it's really important the way that bands or artists brand their work. So that's always a fun conversation for me too, because of the intersection of typography and design with music. It's a similar industry, and it sort of relies on design in an interesting way. What would you say would be some of the differences in that industry and that world now than when you were doing it in that early 2000s period?
Yeah, I mean, I think the single biggest thing is around how it's distributed, in that there was a time when everything was all in the physical CD package. And I remember really distinctly when I can't remember what label came to us and said, hey, we actually don't need a CD package. All we need is a 500 pixel by 500 pixel cover. We don't even need the rest of the booklet or whatever, because this is just going on online. And that was kind of a signal to the end, or at least a transition, if you will. I think that is probably the biggest thing, is like now everything is you're going to find it online, and maybe you'll grab the CD at Target or something like that. But by and large, that experience of getting something physical is there. So I did a lot of Flash websites back in the day, with like the minute long, like downloading, and then it would play this 30-second animation for actually no real reason other than that it was cool. We're starting to hopefully see a transition back to that, where there's more experiences around interacting with all things musical and creativity. It's not just, well, I'm listening to the MP3 online, or I'm just streaming it. There's things that feel a little bit more interactive, or at least motion. I mean, even if you're on like Spotify or Apple Music now, you'll look at an album cover and there is some animation and movement to it. And so I think that can be really cool. But I think the largest thing was the distribution, for sure. And also probably how the bands made money. It's very, very hard to make money now. If you're an artist, if you're a band, people do not realize how little these bands make off of streaming services. And so essentially they have to become traveling t-shirt salesmen to, go to one city, play the show, please just buy a shirt, which gives them enough gas money to get to the next place and maybe eat at Denny's overnight. And then, I'm talking about like more of the up and coming and emerging bands. If you're like a huge band, it's probably a different story, but I do think that has fundamentally changed and made it harder for artists and musicians to honestly just make a living, especially with COVID too, when no touring happened. But that's probably a rabbit trail.
Yeah, no, it is. But I mean, I guess the point to put on that is when things go to shit like that in the world, we rely on creatives to help pull us out of it in a lot of ways. Certainly there are more practical industries that truly help us, like healthcare workers and teachers and people who have been impacted like that. But how do we kind of, we're all stuck inside. We needed people to keep making movies and TV, and music and stuff that helps our imaginations go. And yet, we don't spend enough time, I think broadly, more society doesn't spend enough time thinking about, how these people make a living. And, it's not just a hobby. If you're a Broadway actor,
right.
Broadway shut down for 2.5 years. That's a real challenge.
Oh, it's so true. People like to consume what is created, but they don't, and in some sense they value it, but they don't value it largely from a monetary stance. Or maybe it's not that they don't value it, they don't even realize it.
I think it's the latter, I think people just don't realize how much goes into it. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends who are in the entertainment world and space, and they're the most talented people I know. And some of them, may struggle to make a living for years before they get some sort of commercial opportunity. And it has almost nothing to do with how talented they are or how hard they work. A lot of it's just, like you said, finding the right opportunity and taking advantage of it. So, I think you really have to love that stuff. And maybe that's a good transition into something that I wanted to ask you, since our first conversation was about your own creative identity, because you are, self-described as somebody who has a ton of different interests and passions. And I think that's been expressed in your work. And maybe this is a good transition to talk about your company too. But I wonder, how do you rationalize all of those different creative identities, music and design and photography and fashion and other things that you focus on? How do you align your mind space around all of that?
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back to something you said at the very beginning about creativity as identity. And for me, making stuff is just who I am. Like, I do not feel good if I am not making something. And then all the different kinds of things that I'm doing, whether I'm making fragrances or I'm making music or I'm drawing or painting or whatever, to me is actually the same. It comes out of that same place. It's the same tree, if you will, but it just looks a little bit different. And so for me, a lot of it though is I just want to be curious. Like, I don't know. It's like, wow, that pair of pants is super cool. I wonder if I can sew, or like just like things like that and see if I can figure it out. And candidly, sometimes I'm super terrible at things. Like I was like, I'm going to do pottery. And it took a 4-month course. And I was the only person from the class who walked away with nothing. Literally, I had nothing to show for it. And that's terrible. But it doesn't, to me, that doesn't even matter. That's not the point. It's that, wow, I tried something and I learned something. It wasn't my thing, and that's okay. And then there's other things that I try and I'm really terrible, but I'm like, boy, I love this. Like fragrance making, I've been doing for about 5 years. Easily the hardest thing I've ever done creatively, in part because it's very creative and very personal and there's a lot of like science to it. But yet for me, I loved it. And so it's something I've pushed through and found. So I don't know. Sometimes it's just, I don't think I don't know how to say it. I guess it's just like, I'd be bummed. I'd be really depressed and sad if I wasn't making stuff. And I think it's really fun to learn and be curious and try new things. And if it works, cool. If it doesn't work, it's okay. Finding time to do all of them is difficult. That's actually been something I've had to learn about. But I just like to make stuff. I guess that's really all there is to it.
That really resonates with me. And I'm somebody who likes to try to do all sorts of other stuff too, from a creative perspective. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day, but I've done comedy for 12 years. I've done improvisational comedy for, and not really as a hobby. Like I did it for like 20 hours a week for a decade.
Yeah. That's like part-time. That's like a job.
Yeah, like a lot. I did it. I was in New York and I was in LA and, had groups and produced shows and auditioned and did all sorts of stuff. And then when the pandemic happened, that just went away for there's no theater shows, to go back to what we were talking about before. But I had to figure out, what do I do with all that time creatively? And so I started writing a little bit more, but then I also didn't do stuff. And then I felt guilty about that. And I'm like, it's hard, I think, sometimes to balance all of it, where like you want to make the space for all these creative endeavors, but at the same time, you need to have space to just be a person.
Totally.
And that's okay too. And there's no rule book for it. And I think, I don't know, I really have struggled with that. How do you kind of manage, and you have, 3 kids, as we talked about off air, but how do you manage that piece of it? How do you manage to make space to just be a person?
Well, I will say this. When I am doing any of these things, whether it's my company, VSCO, or all of these other like fun side projects, I'm never really doing it alone. I'm always doing it with someone else. And so that collaboration factor takes off a whole lot of pressure. I think the other thing too is I don't put time frames on these side projects. Like at work, you're like, I have this milestone and we have to ship this by then. That's different. But just for creativity, I won't put any time frames on it. And so like some of this stuff, like I'm trying to launch some fragrances just for fun to get out and like package them and all with a friend. It's going to probably be like a 5 or 6 year thing. Like, it's not going to be like I just knocked that out in a year. And so I think for that, it's like setting the realities of like, hey, let's just do it when we can, take little baby steps and keep progressing and not, I'm doing it with other people, which makes it fun and also takes a lot of the work off. But to your question around finding time for yourself, I think, that is something I struggle with, especially with 3 kids. My wife will be the first one to tell you about that. I do think the pandemic has been super helpful for that. I don't commute. I save like about 2 hours round trip a commute now. I'm able to drop my kids off at school, which sounds basic, but it's super awesome. And then also my kids like to make stuff too. And so it can be like, hey, we're hanging out and painting stuff together and we get all messy and it's fun and we just get to hang out. And so joining those together makes sense. And then just, I'm not a particularly calendar centric person. And that's something that I've had to change where I have to like block out time for not doing things. If like, yes, calendar for meetings and all that, but making time for not doing things too.
Yeah, I think the irony is that to be really creative, you need to not do stuff. You need to think.
Yeah.
You need to just have time where your mind wanders. And I think that's why people often have their most profound creative breakthroughs when they're doing something mundane like taking a walk or chopping vegetables or something, because you're not thinking about a deliverable, to your point, or something that needs to get done. You're just kind of wandering. Yeah. And I love the point you make about the collaboration effect, because it also then it becomes something that's not just about the outcome. Again, it's more about, this is one of my best friends and we're going to make this fun thing, but it's really just a device for me to hang out with them, or with your kids, to just totally. It's a device to hang out with your kids, but also you're scratching that itch of needing to create stuff at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm working on a project with my friend Marv, and he runs, it's called Self. It's a furniture company that it's kind of like Nike ID, where you can choose your tabletop and your legs and stuff like that. But we're just riffing on some prototypes. And it's really fun for me because I've never done 3D physical product design in that. And so I'm learning something. But really, it's to the point, I just get to hang out with a super awesome friend who I wouldn't normally have the time to do. And so, cool, let's riff on this for an hour once my kids are down, and I get to hang out. The relational aspect, I think, is so key, which I guess the theme of this is like coming back to identity. Like creativity is the expression of your identity, but us as people, we need other people. We need those relationships. And so those are more important than probably anything.
Yes. You mentioned VSCO, your company. I want to hear a little bit more about how that came to be, what that is. And, and I have some other questions around that too, that might bring us back to the point you just made. But yeah, I would love to hear more about VSCO.
VSCO is an app. It's photo and video tools and community. There's also a heavy dose of tips and tricks in there, how to be better at this. We started working on it in 2010, became official in 2011. So it's been quite a journey. I guess in some ways, we're technically still a startup, but I guess it's probably hard to call it a startup after 11 plus years or whatever. But it really came out of myself and Joel Flory, who's my co-founder, and then Wayne Wu, who's a creative director, and Zach Hodges, who is a friend / was a bunk bed mate back in the day. We were just chatting about what we wanted in the creative community. What are the things that we would want to build? And so we shoot, let's do a side project and make a creative company that really cared about creators, that really showed up for them. And so that was the goal for that. We launched first with a workshop, in-person workshop, and just about photography and brand. And we used that money what we wanted to use that money for was to build websites, portfolio websites for creatives. But then we realized we didn't have enough money to do that. So we used that money from the workshop to fund what became VSCO Film, which are presets or filters that emulate classic analog digital stock. Cause like, man, I still love film. Now film's kind of had a resurgence, but at the time, like it seemed like film was definitely dying. And we're like, shoot, it would be such a bummer if the next generation doesn't know the beautiful aesthetics of actual film. So anyway, so we launched that, and then we launched the beta of the website portfolio. And the feedback that we got was like, okay, this is cool, but we don't actually need another like website maker. But what we really like is there's this little like drag and drop widget that we called the mobile phone gallery. And it was just, you could upload your mobile phone pictures to it. And people really loved that. And so that's what became what now is people know as VSCO, our app, where it's the editing tools for your photos and videos. And then this community that is really focused on the imagery. And we stayed away from public likes and comments and follower counts. We didn't believe that was healthy particularly. And when you have that stuff, it fosters an environment of like, you make what you hope other people like as opposed to what you like. And so we just cut all of that out there, and we just wanted it to just be essentially a safe space to experiment and try stuff. And so that's what we've been focused on for quite a while, and that's VSCO.
And that set of filters, that would have predated Instagram, right?
Yeah, so Instagram, they did have some. The quality of ours was a lot better. So,
well, I even just mean the idea of the filters on digital, photos is must have been novel at that time.
Yeah, it was a lot less of a thing at that point. And so we just wanted to actually see if could we make the iPhone an actual tool for people that really cared about photos. Because most of what we were seeing at the time was like, okay, here's like kind of a crappy digital photo with a crappy like orange concrete filter texture over it. Like, what can we do to make this be something that someone who really cares about their photography could use as a legitimate camera? And so that was kind of where we set off from that. We didn't want it to be like a gimmick.
I love what you say about community, and this maybe brings it back to the importance of having people, right? But in your life and people to collaborate with and whatnot. But we truly have fallen victim to the like culture and social networks really validating our existence or not, for better or worse. And so I love how you constructed that community to really be centered on what people wanted to create, because I think there you will find that there are audiences for that stuff that you didn't even know about too. I'm sure that surprises a lot of people when they put their work out there thinking that maybe it was just for them and realizing that it touches a chord, with a whole wealth of people from different backgrounds and places in the world that maybe they didn't even know, it would reach.
Honestly, it's been magical to see that. I think we actually, when we did first do that in 2013, 2014, we got a lot of flack for that. Everything from investors to community, like, what are you doing? Of course, you need these numbers. It doesn't make sense to not have them. But I think over the years, people's perceptions and understanding of what social media really is, people are like, whoa, have you seen the Social Dilemma documentary? And I'm like, I haven't seen it, but I know exactly what you're talking about, right? Like, I think people are just more aware of what that means. You are the product, and the mental health implications that come with all of that, of trying to essentially put on your best face, your digital face, and show yourself to a world in a way that is not necessarily accurate to who you are. That's definitely something that people are more aware of, which I think is so good.
You mentioned one audience that was critical of that was investors, right? And I think we talked a little bit offline about something that I think our audience will really benefit from, which is how difficult it was for you and your co-founder to, as designers, as creatives, right, to sell the idea of your business and to get investors to be like, we're going to back these people who are creatives creating a business, not just MBAs or people with an intense sort of business or finance experience. But I'm curious, how was that experience for you?
Well, before I jump into that, for sure, there needs to be more creative founders, because creative people have more interesting solutions and I think are generally more empathetic towards people and can build better products. That being said, it is better today, but I still think that it can be very difficult if you are a creative person to get investors on board, get other people on board. And we've definitely felt that. And we didn't raise, we started riffing on the idea of VSCO in 2010. We incorporated in 2011. We didn't raise till 2014. And it was not because we weren't trying to raise. It was because no one would take us seriously. Joel was a wedding photographer and he was very good. But in Silicon Valley, that's like, okay, what? I was a designer. I didn't go to like Stanford or anything. I went to 5 different schools, including Pikes Peak Community College. And like, there was no cred around like, oh, this is a Stanford graduate, or like, oh, they sold their company to Facebook or whatever. There was none of that. And so it was very difficult for us to raise. And that's the reason why we launched our own workshop. And that was essentially our quote unquote seed money to fund other products that we wanted to build and do ourselves. But that first year, I think we had about 10 full-time employees before Joel and I came on full-time. We were working our other jobs too. We were working 2 jobs. Props to my wife, because that was a very hard season of life. And then fast forward to 2014, when we did raise, I think we had about 40 employees at the time. We were profitable and we had tons of people using our product. And so at that point, the situation had changed. And so investors were much more interested in investing in us because they saw the opportunity. They also had seen that like Instagram had sold for $1 bazillion. And so we had much more leverage to do it on our terms by that point. Also, the other thing, we definitely needed to raise money at that point because we had launched the community feature. And granted, anytime you upload a photo, you look at a photo online, it costs fractions of a penny server cost. But the reality at that point, the community had grown in such a massive way that we were just like, yeah, we're not going to be able to afford the Amazon server space. And so that, and the idea of like, you know what, let's try to build something bigger than ourselves. We realized we needed money for that. Yeah, it was really hard. It was really hard. And I talked to a lot of creatives that have really good ideas for startups, and it's really hard to raise still. Although I do think that there are more VCs out there that are much more open to that. One is, there's one called Hidden. They're based in Kentucky and they only invest in creative companies. That's super cool. So I do think that is changing, but it's hard. I'm rambling a little bit, but I'd also say on the flip side, if you are a creative and you have an idea, I'd also actually really push on the idea, do you need to take money? Sometimes you might, but if you can do it without doing that, I think that's awesome, because then you have more control over what you want to build. Because the reality is like any money that comes in is like kind of like a loan you got to pay back, and you are giving away control of your company. And so just the idea that if you don't have to do it and you can just build something that you really believe in on your own, that is awesome too. Just raising money doesn't mean you're successful. You can build something awesome without that.
That comes through in your story too, where maybe just that workshop was your idea of raising money, right? It was getting creative with some way to prove out the concept and being patient with it, so that by the time you did actually get an investment as creative founders, you had a profitable business, and then it doesn't really matter what your background is at that point, right?
Yeah.
But I think just investing in yourself is a good takeaway there, and finding creative ways to kind of pursue a passion like that, I think is a story that a lot of people can benefit from.
I think a lot of creatives doubt their abilities as anything but creatives, right? Like if you're a designer, you're just like, generally you're probably pretty confident in what you're doing. But outside of that, I think I just see so much, y'all, this is a great idea, go for it. But there's so much doubt around like, oh, I don't know the business and all that. And I still say just like move forward and push forward. And back to that idea of collaboration, like I am not the CEO of VSCO. We have amazing people that are really good in that. And so if you have a great idea and you have the perseverance for it, you can find the people around you to help in the ways that you maybe are not as confident in. I just would encourage anyone who's listening to at least seriously consider building it. We need more creative people leading companies for sure.
Yeah. And, you mentioned a little bit too about mental health earlier. And I think, regardless of whether or not you're starting a business or just as you're a creative, I think that there is definitely that sort of imposter syndrome, or the idea of your creative identity being a vulnerability. And there's a lot of mental health issues that can happen for people who are being creative that may prevent them from believing in themselves or betting on themselves or really pursuing a passion. I think it's just important to press on that piece of it too, that it's just about kind of moving forward and continuing to take steps forward and believe in yourself, even when you're not sure if it's going to work out. But I think that something that is maybe an issue that's happening today is because there actually are a lot of success stories and people who are creators and making a lot of money or building businesses or selling NFTs or doing all sorts of stuff where they're like, you just see this constant wave of success that it breeds this idea that you're not good enough or you're not fast enough or you're not, achieving. And the reality is like everyone has to move at their own pace. Everyone's opportunities are going to be different and everyone's going to pursue a different path through their careers. And that's totally okay. And I think that that's something that creatives need to really try to ingest and understand.
I think you can really start spiraling, myself included, if you fall into that comparison game. And then we compound the issue by daily ingesting more stuff that makes us feel worse about that, right? We call it inspiration, but it can actually have the opposite effect as we're just like scrolling through Instagram or whatever. And you're just like, oh man, they're doing awesome. But really they're going through so many other things. I mean, I was straight up jealous / kind of depressed on myself around like Virgil Abloh. I'm like, man, he is living the creative life that I want to be. Like, man, why he gets to do all this stuff and he's incredible. So it's kind of that like, oh, I want that. And then also like, man, but I'm never going to be able to be that, and then he out of the blue, like passed away. Right. And I realized, whoa, he was going through way more than I ever imagined. And I was like, oh, you got to do something for Luke. Like, no, he was dealing with much, much bigger things. And so all that to say is just like, just make stuff that for who you are and what you love, and love other people too along the way. And we're just all messed up, man. We're all messed up.
That's my life mantra, truly. I mean, we're all just fucked up and trying to get by. And like that's just it. And we're all just trying our best. And sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down, and that's okay. But I think if everyone just realized that and was okay with it, it takes a lot of the pressure off.
Yeah.
I will say, I wish I believed all of this shit I say to other people, though, because I just sit here and brood and be upset about my own shortcomings and stuff. But then I know that that's not the right way to go forward. So I guess what I'm saying is it's much easier said than done. But the happiest people I know in the creative world are the ones who really just are constantly kind of creating stuff.
Yeah.
And the process of that is what gives them joy, not the outcome.
I feel you too. Like I'm like a roller coaster of emotions. Like I'm all over the place all the time. I do think having other creative friends around you really, really helps with that. Because if not, at least for me, I'll come with an idea and then sometimes it just goes. But a lot of times what happens is I just like start circling. And oftentimes then I'm just overthinking itself. But having like friends, or my wife is, an interior designer and does fashion herself, like just to riff off someone and continue to find that energy to keep it fun really helps with that. I think the other part of it too is just like the ups and downs and the doubt, and then the moments of clarity. Like that's just like being human, I'm learning to give myself grace. I'm also learning to realize there's a lot of things that I can't control, but I want to control them. And there's that Kendrick Lamar line. It's like, I'm fucked up and you're fucked up, but we're gonna be all right, And like, I just kind of remember that. It's like, there's a lot of things outside of my control, but ultimately, like, it's gonna be okay.
I do want to, before we leave, talk about Plaza, and the decentralized space you're building, because at the time we were recording this, we just had an interview that published around what design in the metaverse will look like.
Yeah.
And we're talking about NFTs and the type space. We're talking about how type can be applied in all these different mixed reality environments and stuff. But I'm curious, a couple of things, tell us a little bit about that project and how you're thinking about building it, but also I'm curious your thoughts on how people can stay people and stay connected as we move even further into a digital world.
When you talk about crypto world, Web3, NFTs, DAOs, all this stuff, I am super excited about it. And I'm not approaching it naively. There's a lot of issues around everything from environmental to, are we going to lose ourselves in this digital metaverse? All of that thing. And I think those are very real and valid concerns. But what I would say is it's already happening. It's going to happen. This is not a fad. So what is the world we're going to terraform? What is the world we are going to make? And it could be terrible, but there's also opportunity for it to be something really special and really beautiful. Things that we can be yeah, we didn't quite get that right in the past. How can we fix it? So I'm very fascinated by it. I think also the other thing, and this is very much from a creative lens, it is one of the first things I've seen that potentially allows artists and creatives to make what they love and get paid for it. And it doesn't mean that everyone's going to, put out an NFT and become crypto gazillionaires, but it seems like there's a potential cross-section between valuing of art and financial ability to make it as an artist. It's not just about making art, but it's also about having a buyer, but you're not working for a client. You can do what you want. So all that to say, I think it's crazy. I think it's weird. And I'm so interested in it. And I'm very hopeful for creators to be successful doing that. So Plaza, sorry, I went off on a little rant there.
Just to jump in there and respond to that, I couldn't agree with you more. There's so much to learn that every time we kind of dig to answer a different question, we come up with 10 different questions that we didn't know were there before.
I feel you.
But all the ideas around the community piece is so big to me. Yes, empowering artists, but otherwise, just kind of community, tapping into people who have it's like that next generation of finding like-minded people who care about the same type of art or experiences that you do. And yes, it's frothy. Yes, there's going to be stuff that's just random cash grabs that are out there and all that kind of stuff. But that's with any evolution in any space. I think we'll settle. It's going to be really empowering for creatives.
Yeah, I think that is the thing to be thinking about is it's going to be imperfect for sure. But boy, there is potential for creators here to, I don't know. I'm excited about it. And I'm with you. Every single day I'm reading something new and I'm what? I didn't even know you could do that. And it's sparked a lot of me. I just want to make stuff. I started I was seeing all this visual generative art and I was wow, that's super cool. But where are we at with audio stuff? So I've been diving in and learning how to create generative music, and it is crazy. And my wife's is that really good? Because it's a computer making that. I'm well, yeah, but it still has human input and all that. But it's just fascinating to me. I think there's so much potential for tools and community and for monetization for creators in a way that literally I've just never seen that before.
So tell me about Plaza. Tell me about what the idea is, kind of what the opportunity is for creatives and what your vision is for it.
So Plaza is an experimental lab of VSCO. It is Wayne Wu and myself, and then we work with different people from the company. Will come on board at times or work with contractors, but it's a small experimental lab. And it's everything that's in the Web3 space. And so last year we launched Exhibitions, which is curated NFT galleries. We worked with curators to find different artists to sell and share their work. And so that was the project that we did last year. And we learned a lot about that whole space. And then this year we're working on, so many DAOs are created. These are just basically think of them as special clubs around a certain focus. And so for us, we are really interested in okay, I bought this token, or I bought in, I'm a member of this DAO, this club, but what do I do? Right? A lot of people have joined these DAOs or these parties, but then they show up to the party and they're we don't really know what we do. We kind of chat on a Discord channel, but what do we actually do? And so we're working on tools for that of how do you, and once again, through a very creative centric perspective, how do you come together and come up with ideas? How do you research? How do you share? And then once you've come up with an idea, how do you put that out into the world? How do you share that? And it could be gallery, it could be a PDF, it could be a zine, it could be an NFT, it could be a whole lot of things. But we just really want to create this quick, fun space to collaborate with other people on ideation and research, and then sharing that out. So it's a space to do that. So that's what we're working on now with Plaza. But Plaza in general is just our VSCO's experimental arm into Web 3.0, because what VSCO currently has, like, there's a lot of good things going, and we want to keep expanding but not mess that up. And then so much of what Web 3.0 is a reaction against everything that was Web 2.0. And so we are trying to be authentic in that space and build Plaza to be that. And man, I'm just learning a ton. It's crazy.
It sounds like a really wonderful endeavor. And yeah, maybe we can find a way to partner there. We can showcase the Helvetica, I'll tease it, the Helvetica NFT that we're putting together. That'll be our next level partnership out of the podcast. We'll have,
I like it.
We'll have Plaza help us figure out how to enact that community once that's created.
It's cool.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I want to see that. I think there's so much opportunity around typography as it relates.
It's just fun. Yeah, it's
NFTs.
just fun more than anything else. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom and your experiences. I know that our audience will get a lot out of it. Thank you so much for joining us on Creative Characters, and to everybody listening, please have a wonderful rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about Greg and the work he's doing, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode. You can also visit monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. And of course, you can visit his site at greglutze.com. That's Lutze. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype, Christopher Sound, and Marie Tabarez. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Take care.